Welcome to Lesson 7. Today we are discussing modernist poetry. Now to keep us on schedule, I need to condense our two sections, if you look in the syllabus, into one. So my ambition, because it is basically impossible to really dive into all of these poets, so my ambition is basically to give you like this taste of modernist poetry, and or rather a sampling of it. And my hopes are that you will be hopefully inspired. You might like some of the poets that we talk about today, and that you will go on and read some of their poems and that we won't be discussing today on your own. Now, please pause the video each time when you see a poem on screen so that you get a chance to read the poem before you listen to the analysis, because I won't insert these pauses here into the video. So just hit the pause button and read these poems on your own. So we'll start with Ezra Pound. And I want to start with him because in a sense he is one of the most important figures of modernist poetry, one of the poets who we can say was very influential. Amongst others, Hemingway considered him to be his mentor. So we can also, when we're reading his poems, we can try to find sources of inspiration which Hemingway might have used, or look for similarities between the two, though they not necessarily might be that obvious. Okay, but Ezra was born in a frontier town in Idaho in 1885. And he took an MA in 1906, so he was very young, in the University of Pennsylvania, and formed a close friendship during his studies with a student, William Carlos Williams, who is another poet who we will be discussing later on today. By 1920 he moved abroad, and he did make several trips before that, but by 1920 he did regard himself as a permanent expatriate. Certain critics believe that he possessed both a command of older traditions, so the poems that we'll be looking at are very much modernist in their form, but he was very capable at writing in the older tradition as well. But nevertheless, he is probably most regarded for his daring originality. Now, he is considered to be a technical genius by many critics. Like I said, he had a major influence on many poets of his time. He wrote essays for many literary magazines of New York, London, and Paris, which back then constituted a large part of the literary world. And he championed experimental and often kind of underground or unpopular artists whom he personally liked. For example, Gaudier Bjeska. He was a pioneer abstractionist sculptor who died in World War I. James Joyce, amongst the more famous, and most importantly of all, Hemingway, but also T.S. Eliot. Pound, as far as the latter, was instrumental in the final version of The Wasteland. A similarity between Eliot and Pound is that, both required their readers to have this vast familiarity with the classics, the Italian and the English Renaissance, and specialized areas of continental literature, including prominently the works of French symbolists. Their poems were rich with references that would have been unclear to an undereducated reader. Basically, appreciation of much of their poetry, Pound and Eliot's, requires a level of eruditeness, certainly, so that you don't miss all the references, and so that you're able to appreciate the poetry in its fullness. Now, besides his erudite references, Pound often is frowned upon by readers because of his ideological standings. Pound distrusted capitalism. He believed in this notion of this utopian concept of social credit. And in 1924, he actually left Paris for Rapallo, Italy, where he was attracted by Mussolini's kind of promises of this democratic state socialism, and he worked as during the war. He would broadcast these radio programs directed at the English-speaking soldiers, and after the war, he was returned to the United States as a citizen accused of treason. But Pound managed to escape hard prison or maybe even the death sentence by pleading insanity. And he was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And in 1958, Pound, who was 72 at the time, was finally released from the asylum through the intervention of his friends, who included Robert Frost, another poet we'll be discussing today, Ernest Hemingway, W.H. Auden, and aforementioned T.S. Eliot. This, of course, was, very humiliating for him, but, also a punishment for his kind of anti-Semitic and anti-American radio broadcasts, which I've mentioned. So let's consider one of his more famous poems now that we have sort of the context of his life. So, in a metro station, right? So you see the poem here. You can pause briefly if you need another moment to read it. The apparition of these faces right in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. So as it is very minimalistic in its form. And now surely this should again kind of bring Hemingway's writing back to mind, where you try to compact as much emotional and narrative information into as few words as possible. This is certainly what Ezra Pound worked on. And the idea here was to produce a poem reduced to its hardest kernels, he called it, stripped of all excess, but still maintaining the boiled down emotion that he wanted to convey. Now the result here is a 19-syllable haiku-like poem. He was inspired by Japanese haikus as well, but it most importantly captures this sort of impressionistic image. Published originally in 1913, the metro in Paris at that time had been operating for only 13 years. So the idea of having trains moving underground through tunnels as a form, of mass transit, it must have seemed, revolutionary, and was certainly an out-of-the-world experience for a young poet such as Ezra Pound at that time. Now, it is unclear whether the poem describes a point of view of someone riding a metro train and then seeing a crowd of faces on the platform, or whether the eye speaker is the person standing on the platform and seeing the faces kind of arriving on the train, and seeing them when the door opens. Notice that he accomplishes this sense of motion within the poem without the use of a single verb. Now, whatever the case is for where the eye speaker is situated, the poem's brevity certainly helps create the sense of fleetingness and transience. It's only a moment that the eye speaker has to look at the faces before they disappear. Now, notice the word apparition, right? The apparition usually, refers either to ghosts or kind of otherworldly sightings. Now, perhaps this might suggest, the excitement over the novelty of such a travel. Seeing a sea of faces underground might have been something astonishing to him. And he sees them long enough to compare them to a wet black bow. Thus, he juxtaposes two images for us to compare. So this is a rather large leap, right, from these faces which are in this very technological and modern setting, the underground metro station, and then we jump above ground to the petals on the bow, which are organic and seemingly opposite of the other image, yet they spring from the same ground under which the train runs, right? So with a single semicolon, we go from this loud, crowded, maybe even claustrophobic setting to this liberation of an open space in nature and fresh air. So what similarities can we find between the two images? Well, perhaps it is in their movement. If we think of a plant almost growing in fast motion. Now, petals are growing, fading, eventually falling off. Right, they're never in the same spot twice, right? And neither are the faces, which we see in a metro station. They just simply never occur in the exact same configuration. So, in other words, we have this idea of transience being underscored here, or this is a sort of sense of freedom from time limits and space limits, which this juxtaposition of the above images kind of creates, and this is what Imagist poetry aspired to. So Imagism flourished in Britain and in the United States for a brief period between more or less 1909 to 1917, so almost until the end of World War I. And it was definitely part of the modernist movement. And they tried to move away again from sentimentality and the moralizing tone of 19th century Victorian poetry. So the Imagists, as I've mentioned earlier, studied the French symbolists who were experimenting with free verse, a form that kind of mimicked natural speech rather than the accustomed use of rhythm and meter or lines. Now, rules of rhyming were also considered non-essential, so it didn't matter if your poem had any internal rhymes, regular rhymes. And the third thing that definitely influenced Imagism was the Japanese haiku. Right, the Japanese poetry tried to focus on one simple image. Now, Pound wrote in a station of the metro, and considering it to embrace the tenets of the movement, and indeed the poem is considered quintessential of Imagism. So this is something to bear in mind. Now, we will return to Pound, but before we do, I want to discuss another Imagist poem by William Carlos Williams. I will skip his biographic details for now, so that we have a fresher comparison of the two poems in our mind. So again, please pause and read the poem. Otherwise, we'll continue. This poem, originally published in 1923, is considered to be one of Williams's most famous poems, actually. Again, here we have the essence of an Imagist poem. It's free verse describing two images and juxtaposing them to evoke emotion and through it generate meaning. So do you see something similar going on here, right? We have two images that are concerned with, and we compare this, kind of them side by side. So, but if we look at the two images produced or put forth by Ezra's poem and the one here, we see that there's some similarities, some differences. But it definitely seems again that we have an image that refers to technology, right? Albeit very crude one, actually more of a tool. And then the second image refers to nature, which is not the type of Ezra Pound's nature that we saw, but is more of a domesticated one, right? It's chickens. And it certainly does not make one think of transience, freedom, and danger as the petals on a bow, black wet bow. Instead, since both images are kind of more closely related to the same setting, they call our attention, I think, to the compatibility with each other. So it is very unusual to see such an image, or it is very usual actually to see an image like that on the farm, like the one here in this painting. So the focus here is more on man's cooperation with nature rather than rivalry or just an abstract comparison. So what does the poem suggest? I mean, first off, we're told that so much depends on this wheelbarrow. So what do you think depends on it? Do you think the ice speaker is referring to something metaphoric, or is he referring to something concrete? chances are that he means the latter, right? He's likely referring to all the work that the wheelbarrow makes possible, or at least facilitates. Now, thanks to the wheelbarrow, he is able to keep the chickens clean, fed, safe, and alive. Right? He's probably able to maintain his farmhouse, his fence, his grounds, the roads on his grounds, and it's all thanks to this simple tool. And if you think about it, the ice breaker, if the ice breaker was to carry all the loads that are necessary to carry out his work, without this, without the wheelbarrow, he would likely suffer from back problems or other kind of injuries, health-related injuries. So we could even say that his health depends on it, his ability to complete tasks quickly, and so on and so forth. So I hope you get the point. Now, what is significant in this wheelbarrow being red and glazed with rainwater? So I'm not sure if there's any symbolic meaning attached to the color, but if you imagine a wheelbarrow on a farm, right, chances are that the color red will be well contrasted by the greens and grays of a typical farm environment, and I think this painting kind of does well to show this. The fact that he chooses the word glazed with rain, right? Not sprinkled, not covered, not wet with rain, but glazed, kind of like a sports car or maybe a delicious pastry. This kind of personifies the rain, right? So we have men and nature kind of working side by side, right? The speaker works, the rain glazes. So again, the idea of cooperation is forefronted. But more importantly, it seems the ice speaker is noticing something beautiful in a tool that he uses every day, right? It looks almost majestic, right? The color red being brought out by the glazing of the rain. Now, obviously, this requires great sensitivity on his behalf, right? Think about how often you marvel at the beauty of your laptop or computer. Here's another famous poem by Williams. This time we're moving away from strict images poem by including a narrative that is really hidden as a backstory. But the basic idea of kind of juxtaposing two ideas is similar. Now, go ahead and pause if you need to. Otherwise, I'm continuing. So notice that this time we are affecting other senses in a powerful manner, right? That is taste and touch. If we compare this to Williams's previous poem, we'll see that this is much less structured, and it really reads like a note that one might find on a fridge or an icebox in this case. Now, because the poem is not specific as who the reader or who the ice speaker is, it leaves much to interpretation. You can, for example, imagine that the ice speaker is merely the person who found the note and is now reading it. Right, so the poem was actually authored by someone else, like his wife, his girlfriend, his lover. Right, and this flirtatious nature of the message suggests that. So if we kind of decide to take this road of interpretation, then in fact, the woman is the author of the written words and the ice speaker is merely the reader. Imagine this as a scene in a movie, right? A man finds a note on his icebox, he reads it and smiles to himself, right? That's sort of the idea here. Now, the first stanza of the poem calls attention to an action, a deed committed. Right? There's nothing wrong, right, so far, right, in what happened. I mean, people eat plums all the time. But the second stanza is a confession, right? The author of the note admits that she is aware that she is perhaps kind of, taken a liberty a bit too far, right? It is an admission of guilt somehow, that she realizes that he might have been saving these plums for himself. So when the third stanza comes, right, it's a sensual apology. The author is saying in her own defense that the plums were irresistible. So obviously we could probably find some references to, you know, the Garden of Eden here, but it is probably not what you know the main point of this poem is, right? Rather, I would say it's the sensuality of it, right? She uses a sibilance, right? Sibilance, which basically means we're stressing the S's. So she, towards the end, right, so sweet and so cold, right? And this focuses the reader's attention kind of on the pleasure that she derived from taste and touch in her, you know, experience of the plums. Now, so obviously this is a game that lovers play. Perhaps this is only a prelude to, you know, what will happen when the reader and the author of the note meet later that day or evening. So she's kind of teasing him, right? They were so delicious I could not resist them. What we you know, are in fact doing here, we're juxtaposing one clear image with a narrative which hides behind words, right? Rather than two images, as was with the previous poem, right? So the image here is obviously of these plums primarily, right? That's what the words kind of best describe here. The experience of the plums, even. You may, of course, have a different interpretation. You might think that, you know, the I speaker is actually the author of the words. He's leaving this note for someone. And this might evoke slightly different feelings and create a different mood. But what matters is, you know, the mechanism upon which this poem hinges. Now, William Carlos Williams was born in 1883 in New Jersey, and he studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, where, as I mentioned, he met his fellow imagist Ezra Pound, and he was encouraged actually by Pound and influenced by him. And he began publishing his poetry, essays, plays, novels, and translations, but this wasn't his main source of income. I mean, he worked as a doctor, as a pediatrician. Williams was associated with the Imagism movement in the early anthologies by Pound. He was included in those, but later he kind of came to disagree with Pound's emphasis on the superiority of European culture versus American culture. So Williams was probably more patriotic in that sense. And he worked to establish this American identity in poetry, spending time moving kind of in various artistic circles in New York City, but also mentoring younger poets. So kind of giving back what Ezra Pound gave to him. And Williams chose to write about everyday subjects instead of following kind of illusion-heavy classical works of Eliot and Pound. So in those terms, he's very much different from them. And because of this, I think he was very popular in the early 20th century. And I do encourage you to go out and find some more of his poetry. Returning to Ezra Pound, let's take a look at another poem of his. Now, what's important to remember before we start reading the poem is that, again, recall that Ezra Pound was part of the so-called lost generation, the writers who were disillusioned by America's culture and values, and they moved to Europe, right? They self-exiled. Now, he's writing this poem long after Walt Whitman died, right? So we see that this is packed on, we have a reference to Walt Whitman, the poet. Whitman and Pound actually never met in person, or it is very unlikely that they did, because Walt died when Pound was only 7 years old. Also, you know, 7 years earlier, before this poem's publication, Pound wrote an essay in which he kind of denounced Whitman as this quintessential American writer, as he was regarded and is regarded by most people today. Now, remember that Pound was enthralled by the classics. So the writers of, you know, Italian and English classical period, and during that time in his life, Pound saw Whitman's transcendentalism and, you know, his sensual style as self-indulgent and over the top. Now recall that Whitman was a leading, again, transcendentalist who is best known for his work Leaves of Grass, and is considered to, again, to be one of the most influential American poets. So for someone like Ezra Pound, he would have been a natural reference point. But initially, Pound refused Whitman as a source of inspiration. 7 years after writing his essay, What I Feel About Walt Whitman, that's how it was titled, he seems to have a change of heart. But as we're reading this poem, the question is, does he really change his opinion on Whitman? So go ahead, pause and read the poem. Well, let's dive in. Ezra Pound starts by declaring that he wants to make a truce. So notice that he's not making peace. A truce is more of a temporary, a ceasefire, or they're agreeing to stop fighting for a while. Now, in the second line, he cites the reason for this gesture, and notice that it is focused on Ezra's feelings, not on Whitman's. Right? So it's not, "Oh, I'm sorry that I've caused you pain." Right? So Ezra is saying, in a sense, that he himself kind of felt inconvenienced by having to detest Whitman. He's tired. He is the one that is tired by having to bear these emotions. And then only in the third line does he become more conciliatory. Right? He refers to Whitman as a pig-headed father. Right? So still a backhanded kind of compliment. He's calling him a father, but a pig-headed one. Right? So what does pig-headed mean? I mean, he's basically calling Whitman obstinate, right? That he will have his way, and that's the only thing that he will agree to, right? But also pig-headed, the hyphenated word is obviously kind of evokes these images of pigs on a farm, so idea of backwardness or maybe filthiness even. Yet Ezra admits that it was through his own, so Ezra's immaturity, or the ice speaker's immaturity, that he was unable to befriend his pig-headed father. So the insinuation here is that because the father is too obstinate in his ways, it is the son who needs to make the concession in order to enable this relationship, right? So usually we'd expect this sort of maturity from a father, not from the son. Now, in line 6, he continues his kind of underhanded attack, right, conceding to Whitman that he was the first to break the new woods, meaning that Whitman was a pioneer in the American canon. And he's admitting this much. But all Whitman managed to do, if we look at this metaphor, is to merely break the new woods. So, in other words, he made a path into the thicket. Maybe he cleared some of the trees, but not much more than that, right? Now, because we learn in line 7 that it is Ezra Pound who will in fact be the one that uses the wood, right, as a resource for carving to create art out of it, we see kind of the relationship forming. Whitman is the lumberjack, so to speak, and Pound is the sculptor, right? So only the latter. So only Ezra Pound is the true artist, although he does not depend, or although he does depend on the labor of Whitman or laborers like him to supply him with the raw materials that he needs to create his art. And this is all that Ezra is willing to yield to Whitman. He still refuses to consider him an artist, right? That has not changed. He strengthens his metaphor of the relationship being that of a supplier and an artist with the final sentence saying, "Let there be commerce between us," right? Again, not peace, not any deeper affection, but instead they're agreeing to do business. You will supply me, and I will be the one that makes true art out of this. So in a sense, we see that Pound has not really changed his mind about Whitman's poetry as far as it being a true art form. Instead, he agrees that his verses make a good resource for someone who is a true artist such as himself. So we could therefore understand that this poem is a statement really directed not at Whitman, right? Because Whitman is dead when this is being written. But Ezra is actually writing this likely to his contemporary critics and poets, right? He's kind of signaling to them that despite what I wrote 7 years about Whitman, it is likely that you might find in my new poems that I'm composing right now some expressions that, or maybe even borrowings or even inspirations taken from Whitman, and I'm telling you in this poem why that is. Because because Whitman is a good resource. Now, on a final note, notice how Pound is very consistent in his imagery, right? It's almost entirely refers to trees, at least the latter half of the poem, or at least nature, right? We have rope, wood, carving, sap, root, and they're evoking this this sense of something raw, organic, unbridled, and most importantly, unrefined, because this is what he considered Walt Whitman to be. Now, as far as unrefined is concerned, and since we're on the subject of Whitman, I think it would benefit us to take a look at a poem who is often considered to be the greatest American poet since Whitman. So he's definitely very often put on par with Whitman. Robert Frost, I'm sure you've heard of his name. He is certainly the most universal in his appeal, meaning he can appeal to the largest amount of readers. And in a sense, he looks, what he does very often in his poetry, he looks for deep and universal meanings in everyday objects, places, things, natural habitats, and things that he observes very often, are again in the natural setting. Some of his poetry has been, classified as primitivistic. So recall this from our discussion of Mice and Men. It is, kind of poetry or literature which focuses on primitive people as being kind of nobler and less flawed than civilized people because they don't have the veneer of civilization to kind of hide their true nature. This is mostly because of the subject matter of Robert Frost's poetry. But his poems also, due to their subject matter, often are called as kind of these American pastorals, right? So as many of his poems are literary compositions on a rural theme, right? That's what essentially constitutes a pastoral. So let's take a look at one of his more recognizable poems, Mending Wall, written in 1914. So go ahead and pause and read this. Okay, so some background on the poem. Frost ran actually himself a poultry farm in New Hampshire for nearly 10 years. And eventually the farm went bankrupt, it failed, but Frost considered this time period in his life as most peaceful and tranquil, and kind of reflecting what he, how the emotion that he describes of the rural setting in his poems. Now, the wall mending is something that Robert himself experienced. He partook in the upkeep of his wall along his own, basically the boundary of his place with his own neighbor, who's actually credited as kind of being the source for the line, "Good fences make good neighbors." Now, this was actually a proverb in colonial times. So it's, the neighbor didn't invent this saying. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that despite having owned a farm, Robert Frost was in fact kind of educated and living most of his life and spending his time in cities. Therefore, one way of approaching this poem is to consider it as a sort of explanation of these rural notions or ideas or the way things people do out there to a city dweller, such as, for example, us. So firstly, notice that the poem is not organized in stanzas, right? It's just 45 lines acting together, almost like sentences in a monologue. Although it kind of sustains a meter if you count the syllables, he's not too strict about it, right? He doesn't stick to it in all the lines. For example, line 27 would require that the word neighbors be pronounced as a single syllable. And this, if we look and analyze the poem that way, we would certainly find examples of similar kind of breaking of the meter. Now, but let's instead focus kind of on the imagery and what he conveys. So he opens with the line which he later repeats: "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." Now he begins by referring to nature's insistence on dismantling man-made walls. Notice that the second line begins at the ground, right? And it moves like a spreading frostbite up to the upper boulders where it encounters sunlight. It's almost like a camera movement, it moves from low angle to high angle. And it contains sensory information that take us from this feeling of cold, freezing, to hot, right? And that helps us understand the force that nature utilizes to dismantle this wall. Next, we are told that there are hunters, right? But the question is, do they destroy the walls out of spite? Do they do this on purpose? Now, it seems, to me at least, that the way they are portrayed is that they're almost in this craze. They're pursuing a rabbit and they want to get that rabbit at all costs. And it seems that they aren't very cautious of the fact that they're actually in the process destroying walls. It seems that they are unaware of this. And it's almost as if some greater force possessed these men and used them as tools for the dismantling of the wall. So we have this idea of a mysterious force acting, right? And it is further strengthened by line 10, where the ice speaker admits that no one sees the holes being made. They just seem to appear almost magically. Now in line 12, something interesting happens. If you have read the poem already, then you'll know that the ice speaker will express his doubts about mending the fence. He's not sure if there is any point to it. Yet here we are, right, and we see that the project comes out of his initiative, right? It's not the neighbor that calls him and says, hey, we need to fix this fence. He's the one that calls his neighbor. They both stay on their sides of the fence, so the physical barrier is maintained between them at all times. And so think, what could possibly the fence symbolize? What could it be its metaphoric meaning? What could this barrier between human beings stand for? Note that the stones that each of them picks up from their side and places on the wall are like loaves or balls, right? So they're round in a sense, or rounded. So what do these similes suggest about these rocks, right? Now, if they were sharp-edged, perhaps they would be easier to kind of put on the wall. They would probably stay there, because they're rounded, they kind of want to fall off. But they also seem less harmful, right? Especially if they're compared to loaves. Now, if they were sharp-edged, they certainly would kind of bring forth to the mind this idea of danger or conflict. Now, we don't have that here. What do you make of the spell metaphor, right? He talks about placing the rocks and saying, stay where you are until our backs are turned, right? He's comparing that to almost casting a spell. Well, this certainly reminds us of, again, of the mysterious force which we have established earlier, which deteriorates the walls. So the speaker imagines himself appropriately as a sort of wizard, to fit kind of the vocabulary of that notion of this mysterious force. More importantly, do you imagine that the words kind of stay where you are, that these words are uttered in anger, frustration, or would you say that they're kind of said more playfully? Now, it might be that this is a mix of both of these emotions, as the subsequent lines might suggest. First off, A, they are wearing out their hands with this work, but also B, this work is all of a sudden being compared to a game. And notice that this one line changes in our minds the barrier of walls from an obstacle to something more like a tennis net. Okay, so reading on. After some work has been put in, the ice speaker begins to question the point of mending the wall, right? He notices that they don't really need this wall to keep their trees separate from each other. His neighbors replies basically by citing the proverb. And the ice speaker kind of takes up this sort of friendly challenge, right? He says, spring is the mischief in me. Notice this idea of the game has already been prepared beforehand. So the new game becomes convincing his neighbor that they don't need a fence. Now this again is a game, and then perhaps we would question whether or not the ice speaker actually agrees with the proverb, or whether he actually disagrees with it. So perhaps he's playing at first the devil's advocate, right? Just so that he can stay and play the game. So he provides his neighbor with a few arguments against the wall, and eventually returns to the notion of the mysterious power that wants to bring this wall down. Now, look at what he says about the elves. Why do you think the ice speaker says that he would like to hear the neighbor suggest that it was elves who were behind this mysterious power? I mean, notice that he specifically doesn't want to use the word himself. So why does he want to hear it from his neighbor? Well, the idea of believing in elves, connotes either backwardness or lack of rationality, right, or childishness. So this is why this ice speaker probably would like to hear such things being said by the neighbor, because then he could use this as an argument as of his own superior rationality, and then explain to his neighbor condescendingly that there is no such thing as elves, right? Plainly put, he's looking for signs of intellectual inferiority in his neighbor to kind of as a source of his adamancy over the fence, right? So he thinks that he's so stubborn because he's basically backward, and he does in fact characterize the ice speaker as such. When he says he sees him moving in the darkness, right? But it's not just the trees. And he's a savage, and he's someone who's mindlessly keeping his father's saying. He's putting his neighbor down, right? The ice speaker is basically being condescending towards his neighbor, to make himself feel superior. So we can therefore conclude that the ice speaker is irritated with his inability to change his neighbor's mind. And notice that he seems to forget that all along this was a game. So let's return to the question. What could the wall symbolize? What do you think this wall between human beings could be symbolic of? Well, there's probably many ideas that we could have. One thing is for sure that it could stand for the borders of their personal identities, right? One is a pine man, the other one is a pear man. The wall keeps that very clear. Another thing, the wall could perhaps stand for, cordiality or civility. The manners that we have when talking with strangers, right? We don't talk with neighbors the same way we would do with very close friends. We're less honest with them. We have specific phrases that we use. The wall could perhaps suggest that. The wall could be even something as kind of universal as laws, right, that govern society and keep people from infringing upon each other. So it could, the wall as something that protects people from each other. Well, those are a few ideas. Can you think of any other ones? I'll be happy to hear your ideas in class. Now, more importantly, ask yourself, what do you think about the idea of maintaining walls with your neighbors yourself? Which side of the argument would you take? Would you take the ice speakers or the neighbors? One poem obviously doesn't do Frost justice, but his work is, I find at least, so appealing that I hope that you will look up more of his poetry on your own. But for now, we have to move on, and we're moving on to Wallace Stevens, another poet born 1879 in Reading, Pennsylvania. Much like William Carlos Williams, he supported himself by means of another job, meaning he did not support himself by writing poetry. He worked as an insurance lawyer in New York City while writing his modernist poems. Now, Stevens received the National Book Award in 1951 for his poetry book, The Auroras of Autumn. In 1955, he received it again, but also this time the Pulitzer Prize for the collected poems of Wallace Stevens. While ill from terminal cancer, he converted to Catholicism, and he died several months later in 1955. Now, we mentioned the end of his life because we see this poem certainly dwells upon the idea of death. Now, looking at the poem, we have no doubt that it is modernist. Looking at the poem, we have no doubt that it is modernist. We see very definite experimentation with form. We have odd adjective-noun juxtapositions, such as kitchen cup, concupiscent curds. We have horny feet, and odd phrasing such as bid him whip or finale of seam. It is easy to dismiss all this, at first glance as gibberish, but in fact, Stevens is being very playful with his words, and in his strategy is definitely close to that of the Imagist, right? He creates two separate scenes instead of images and juxtaposes them to yield emotion and meaning, although we wouldn't identify this poem necessarily as an Imagist poem. Looking at the poem itself, it is difficult to identify who the ice speaker is in relation to all the other characters appearing in the poem. However, considering that he uses the imperative voice, right, he commands people, he seems to have the ability also to transgress the vicinities of this described world, very likely a house. We may conclude that he is the owner of this place, or at least the person who is in charge here. He's in charge of running whatever it is that's going on here. Okay, so the first scene appropriately is kind of described in stanza 1, the second scene in stanza 2. And we start off with the imperative voice, which orders a muscular roller of big cigars and tells him to whip up some ice cream. Okay, first, the idea of big cigars should kind of forefront this idea of luxury and pleasure and enjoyment of life. But because in line 4 and 5 we learn that there are wenches and boys, wenches as in girls, who are his observers. They're kind of sitting and looking at this guy. The roller of cigars, or at least his description, take on this erotic tone, right? He's muscular. He whips, and look at the way, and they look at the way his production of ice cream is described, right? So if we look at the wording again, this is essentially what well, the image here is essentially what the man is doing. But the curds of ice cream are concupiscent, right, meaning filled with sexual desire. So this is a very odd and flamboyant word, and the man himself again is described as muscular. And we could also use the idea of a big cigar, kind of being suggested of a phallic symbol. Now, okay, this might be over the top, but it makes more sense if we consider that this is how possibly the wenches, again, meaning girls, and boys view him. Chances are that they are prepubescent or pubescent, thus the raging hormones make them kind of sexualize almost everything they see, especially since they find themselves in a kind of an extraordinary situation. So something must be happening here, right? Since we have kids and we have ice cream being made, and we know the boys have brought flowers, right? In line 4, the ice speaker again refers to the girl as wenches. So let's explain that word. It actually really forefronts this idea of a promiscuous woman, sometimes even prostitute, and he says that they are dwaddling. Okay, so he might be the ice speaker might be slightly annoyed with them, albeit the choice of kind of these fun sounding words, wenches and waddle, right, suggests his more of a playful nature. So he's not actually mad, but he's pretending to be mad, He sees the girls are hanging out in the kitchen doing nothing, but being obviously interested in the cigar roller and the ice cream that he's making. And another thing that seems to annoy slightly the ice speaker, or maybe it is other people, other guests in the house, is the fact that the girls are in such a dress as they are used to wear. Basically, this tells us that they have not dressed fit for the occasion, so they're just basically dressed in their ordinary clothes. But he says this is all okay with him. And he says he's okay with the boys who are bringing flowers and old newspapers. Now, the idea of bringing flowers obviously suggests romance, where the first thing we think the boys are bringing the flowers for the girls. But we will learn in the next stanza that this is not the case. But the icebreaker already created such a kind of centralized atmosphere that he's able to capitalize on it, at least for now, with this additional information. However, he is already beginning to prepare us for what we'll see in the next stanza. Notice that the newspapers are last month's. So what does this suggest? The usual theme probably of transience, right? This is what most poetry likes to deal with, or much of poetry. So the youths are sitting in the room feeling kind of sexual tension, all the while remaining oblivious to the passing of time, suggested again by the newspapers, right? This month went by so fast. Stanza 1 ends the same way stanza 2 does, and we'll discuss that a little later, what that could possibly mean. In the meantime, ask yourself, what or whom do you think the Emperor of Ice Cream might be? Now, stanza 2 takes us to a new setting, probably a different room in the house. And again, we begin with an imperative voice that instructs someone, we don't know who, to take a sheet off of a dilapidated dresser. We're told it's right, missing 3 glass knobs, and to put it over a woman, minding to cover her face. Now, the state of the drawer suggests that it is old, and perhaps it was left unprepared because its owner was either too old or too feeble to fix it themselves. Now, interestingly, we are told that the woman whose face is being covered used to embroider the sheets with fantails or images of birds or pigeons. So thus we can conclude that both the sheet and the dresser had belonged to the woman. In lines 13 and 14, our suspicions as to the woman's state are confirmed, right? We are told that she is cold and dumb, dumb meaning unable to speak. In other words, she is very much dead. And then we're told that her stiff feet protrude from under the sheets, which basically proved too short to cover her fully. Thus, the revelation is that, again, we are dealing with a dead woman in the room. So, the occasion for which the boys and girls have gathered and the cigar roller is whipping up ice cream is probably a wake. Again, the stanza ends with the same line. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. So we could understand that to first off, be a reference to the cigar roller, but it is likely that there's some sort of commentary here on the nature of the human being, right? So it seems that the occasion is very solemn, right? The characters have gathered to say goodbye to a dearly departed woman, yet all the while, all the people who are alive, right, they're thinking about, yes, how sad this occasion is, but really what everybody is kind of thinking about is the delicious ice cream that is being whipped in the neighboring room. So in other words, Stevens seems to be observing that even, or especially when faced with death, we the living possess kind of this insatiable hunger and lust for life. Moving on to our next poet, Edward Estlin Cummings. He was born in 1894. He was a Harvard graduate, and much like Hemingway, served as an ambulance driver in France before America's entry into World War I. Now, his experiences led him to challenge conventions, even once kind of concerning poetry, or actually especially those, perhaps. Now, My Sweet Old Etc. captures his aversion to the Americans who had never seen real warfare, unlike himself, yet because of often their age and status or propaganda, assumed that they knew better even than a veteran. So this poster, in a sense, I think displays the sentiment that Cummings is criticizing in My Old Sweet Etc. So briefly, let's discuss this poem. First off, why do we use, or when do we use, etc.? Right? when we are listing items, right, when we decide not to list all of them, so instead of finishing the entire list, we say etc. So some items in that list are more important, and those are the ones that we usually name, while others we decide to abbreviate and kind of exclude. So in other words, etc. may suggest the least or less important items on the list. So in an army, it is likely the foot soldiers who are actually doing the fighting, rather than the officers, generals, politicians, or heroes. Now the icebreaker begins the poem almost like a letter, a letter that either a soldier would receive or have written himself. My sweet old. And then you fill in the blank, right? Because etc. Because the identity is not relevant. Then he tells us of an Aunt Lucy. Notice that she's not capitalized. This suggests that she might be a generic Aunt Lucy rather than a specific person. However, she seems to know what the recent war was fought for, right? A question that most fighting men probably would have had a hard time answering. So notice Cummings uses expected lines and uses broken up parentheticals to heighten the fact that we're dealing with almost this caricature of these people. And next he tells us of Sister Isabel, someone's Sister Isabel, who thought that she, either the aunt's sister or maybe the soldier's sister, who thought she participated in the war effort by making socks and ear warmers for the soldiers. Again, she is also not capitalized, so she's generic. And the parenthetical "not to mention" seems to suggest that someone is actually telling about her, right? It's someone is boasting of how patriotic their family is. Next, the breaks are kind of used to a shocking effect, right? My mother hoped that I would die. It almost reads that way. Now the breaks frame her as this heartless being, even though later we reveal that her intent was to have her child die bravely if it came to it, right? That this is probably what the mother said. While the father would become hoarse, right? We're told hoarse in his voice, suggesting that he's either moved or excited to the point where his kind of emotions are making his voice hoarse and impeding his ability to speak with a clear voice when he's talking about the privilege of dying for one's country. Now, lines 19 and 26 inform us, finally, that the soldier, likely the recipient of the letter, was lying in the mud, probably taking shelter from a shelling, and he was really surviving or keeping his sanity by not thinking of all those people described, not of the aunt, the sister, the father, the mother, but of having fond and sensual thoughts of his wife, girlfriend, or lover. So Cummings seems to suggest that at the end of the day, all of the high and abstract ideals that he was fighting for, or the soldiers were fighting for, they're worth less than the physical and emotional experiences that a human being has in their lifetime. Now again, I encourage you to go out and read more of his poetry. You will find that it is very, very experimental in its form. Now, our final poet is Langston Hughes. And he was a writer of poetry, short stories, novels, plays, songs, and essays. One of the most prominent representatives of Harlem Renaissance, which was a movement in the 1920s, which centered in the New York City district of Harlem, and it really expressed the African American identity. His portrayals of the black community often provoked African American literary critics. They were saying that he was portraying Africans or blacks in a negative light. But Hughes always responded by saying that simply he was depicting life the way he saw it, and he did not care about political correctness. Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri on February 1st, 1902. And his father was a rancher, a businessman, and a lawyer, while his mother worked as a teacher. His background was varied and very colorful. By the time he wrote his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, which came out in 1926, he had spent time as a cook, waiter, truck, a farmer, college student, a nightclub doorman in Paris, and a sailor, and he lived in numerous American cities and also foreign countries as well. Now, his most famous poem, The Weary Blues, I feel like it needs no real commentary, so I'll ask you to listen to the recording of it, which is attached in the following video. And I think it does well to also kind of encapsulate what the Harlem Renaissance was about.